Bienvenue à Entrecadre, grâce à l'école du Canada de la fonction publique. Moi, je m'appelle Daniel Lowen. Je suis ici avec quelqu'un qui comprend bien le météo si humide que c'est maintenant à Ottawa en été. We have with us Gerry Salembier, the Assistant Deputy Minister with Western Economic Diversification de l'économie de l'Ouest du Canada, responsible for British Columbia. Gerry has agreed to come and share with us his insights about speaking truth to power and surviving that responsibility. Welcome, Gerry. Good to have you with us.
Thanks, Daniel. Glad to be here.
You have experience with Finance Canada extensively, with international trade, foreign affairs, and now with Western economic diversification. You've worked in regions as well as the national headquarters. You have a pretty broad assessment of how things function in the senior ranks of the public service. And I'm sure you're aware that there are those who look at different, who, let me say, pay attention to, I had to work pay in there somehow, to the idea of wanting to be able to speak up and flag issues that might be of concern. There's often a sense among senior public servants or among executives in particular that it's not being a team player if I challenge the direction things are going. And we are aware que ça vaut la peine d'avoir la confiance, de partager avec du respect et tact, de partager des craintes, des possibilités des échecs, des choses comme ça. Can you talk to us a bit about your experience in speaking truth to power and surviving the responsibility?
All right. I will certainly try to tackle that, Daniel, but as you know from past associations, I don't always follow instructions really well, so we'll do this by way of examples for the most part.
Sure.
So if this seems like just a bunch of war stories from a guy's career, that's because it will be a bunch of war stories from a guy's career. I have, as Daniel said, worked both in the regions and in Ottawa. I've worked in line departments and in central agencies. I've worked in Canada, obviously, and I've worked internationally. So got a kind of an interesting set of career experiences to bring to bear on that question of speaking truth to power in a bunch of different contexts. Yeah. I should start by thanking the Canada School for having me here and for picking a time for this presentation that allows people all across the country, in all regions of the country, to participate. I kind of have to say that because, full disclosure, my wife is the Director General for the Canada School for the regions outside of the NCR.
And it's a good point on its own merits.
But on that speaking truth to power, I'll, as I said, speak mostly by way of examples, but probably the most important thing is that you have to be seen to be getting the job done. You will get a lot more airtime. You'll get a lot more people willing to listen to you, even though you may not be, following the conventional wisdom, if what you're trying to do is to get the job done. So often what a minister or a deputy minister really wants from you is summed up in 3 words: just handle it. And if you're doing that, and even if you are speaking some uncomfortable truths to power, you're going to get a lot farther than if you're, talking about your favorite pet project or talking about something that's really just interesting to you. You've got to be the person that is there to help solve the problem at hand.
C'est tellement un bon point que je ne peux pas simplement arriver à la porte avec une liste des plaintes, des préoccupations, d'autres choses, si je ne suis pas quelqu'un sur lequel on peut compter pour faire avancer des priorités du gouvernement.
Ouais. Et si on a une réputation pour ça, oui, ça va te servir très, très bien dans tous les différents contextes. Right. And so that habit of speaking truth to power and that habit of doing so in a vein that is about solving the problem is what's going to get you ahead. So some of the examples that I have are, a lot of them are drawn from my time in finance. And one of them, probably one of the most interesting ones is, so often in finance, your job is to, I'll apologize to anyone from finance who's actually on the line here, but so often your job is to say no. The sad truth of the matter is it's very, very often, like 9 times out of 10, the answer ends up being some version of yes. So you really should feel for those people from finance. Got it? Yeah, just
Right.
open them, right?
Right. We have about 200 folks watching, so there's probably some finance folks in there.
They deserve your kind thoughts. But one of the examples is from a time when we did actually have to say yes, and it was when we back in the mid-90s when we slew the deficit dragon, and we overshot a bit. In 1997, we ended up with about $800 million to the good, and we were charged with finding a useful way that fit with the agenda of the government of the day, something that could be usefully done in line with good stewardship of public funds with that $800 million. And we settled on something that ended up being the Canada Foundation for Innovation. But to get there, we had to put together some of the best minds on the subject of university infrastructure in the country. So one of the things we did was put together a kind of a ginger group that consisted of a couple of past university presidents, the heads of the granting councils, some senior former university presidents, I won't name them all, but a very august group of individuals. And we convened them in a series of 5 or 6 meetings and arrived at the definition of what this Canada Foundation was going to be about. We also arrived at the name Canada Foundation for Innovation, by the way. And that group, distilling the advice from that group, was probably one of the most effective means of speaking truth to power, by lining up a group of eminent Canadians with a deep knowledge of a subject in order to provide some quick advice to, in that case, the Finance Minister, Paul Martin, on the creation of a new instrument, of a new funding instrument. That was probably one of the most effective ways in that particular context of having overshot a budget to get the kind of confidence in the advice that we were putting together, so that you could do something in a time when everybody else was being cut. You could actually do something in the way of expenditure of public funds.
And if I'm going to the top, I take the point that having consulted with key players, with people with credibility themselves, and having that credibility of yourself of getting things done and focusing on the big issue, focusing on progress. The flip side of that being taking people with you who are going to strengthen that as well. You've really done your homework in that example.
Yeah. I'll use another one that speaks very much to that theme. When we went through program review, another example from the mid-90s.
Sure.
I promise they won't all be examples from the 90s, but when we went through program review, it was an exercise that, called on deputy ministers to come to the center, lined up to the central agencies, and propose means of achieving a 15% cut in the expenditures of the department. Most deputy ministers came to the table and said, I can't possibly cut anything, right? And so what happens in that instance is, okay, we're going to cut everything by 15%, which is usually not a great result from the point of view of the integrity of the programming of that department. But at the time I was in finance, I was in charge of the transport files, and we had in Transport Canada both a deputy and a minister that were really keen on using the opportunity to make a fundamental change in Transport Canada. And so the fundamental change was to move transport from being an owner and an operator of transportation assets and infrastructure to a policymaker and regulator. And that was a massive undertaking, which involved a lot of privatizations and a lot of structural change. But you had a deputy and a minister that were keen to pursue and to take advantage of that opportunity, rather than just sort of falling back on woe is me, let the center do to me whatever they will, right, and it'll be their problem. Out of that came a department which was much stronger, had a fundamentally different role, and actually turned in over and above that 15% target through things like privatizations. So it was very much in line with the agenda of the government of the day, and it was an approach that was bold, and it ended up with a much stronger result than had that same department just come in and said, okay, cut everything by 15%.
That would be when it's all before my time, the 90s, so I'm trusting your word on it. But that's when transport became more of a policymaker and a regulator.
Very much so, yeah. Those that are now working at transport will tell you that transformation is incomplete and there's still things left to be done, right, which would be fair enough, but it was a massive step in that direction.
I note that you're not saying speaking truth to power in that scenario would have been effective as saying, was not effective as saying, no, I can't possibly cut. It was saying, listen, to get done what you want and to get done what we think is needed, here's the blend. Here's what could work.
Yeah, and there were some difficult decisions in there, some really difficult decisions that were tough to get across the line. The privatization of Canadian National, the privatization of the air navigation system. These were not easy things to do.
Yeah.
But they were part and parcel of that conversion.
The analogy that comes to mind is the idea that the center, the mandate of the government might be to increase fiber in your diet, and the department may be getting requests from clients who want ice cream. And we can either give them broccoli ice cream, which won't be very effective, or come up with a fruit salad, which provides the fiber and the sweet treat you're looking for. Finding something that brings together what you believe is necessary plus what the government is looking for.
Yeah, and I think that's an example. Your nutritional example, though, it's still a bit early in the morning for me. I'm still on Vancouver time, and so I can't really stomach the broccoli ice cream.
Our friends in Halifax are doing fine.
Let me give you another example, though, of an area where just handling it was pretty instrumental. So at the time, back in the day when I was handling those transport files, we had a finance minister, Paul Martin, who had some family interests before he came to politics that were, guess what, in the transportation sector, and he did everything necessary to park those in a blind trust and so on.
Right.
But there's still just the tiny chance of a perception of a conflict of interest. So one of the tasks that had to be handled somewhere in the finance department is somebody had to make sure that there was not any piece of paper involving transportation issues that was going to land on the minister's desk. So as the guy at the sort of director level who was responsible at the time, could have taken a number of different approaches to that, as in, well, let's let the minister's office handle that, or let's let the correspondence unit handle that, or what have you. But I decided that in order to make the maximum amount of progress on these files, I need that to go well, and so I'm going to handle that. I'm going to be the guy that makes sure that none of those pieces of paper land where they shouldn't. And I think that was an example that where the deputy and the minister's office, for that matter, really quite appreciated it when somebody just kind of stood up and said, "I'm going to handle that," rather than delegating the job upward or sideways. That approach of just handle it can get you quite a bit of credibility.
I'm struck by that, Gerry, in contrast to the number of folks who are looking up for someone to make a decision. And if we're paid in the 100,000, the 120, the 150,000, someone is paid to make that decision, and it may very well be us rather than waiting for approval or direction.
Yeah, and that sort of delegating up approach, not going to serve you well. Very few instances where that's going to serve you well. You have to at least, make an effort to frame that issue and to propose a solution and to get behind that solution.
Right.
It may not always be the one that ends up being adopted, but coming to that discussion with a solution rather than saying, here's the problems that you folks will have to solve because I couldn't quite get there. Right.
Right. I had an ADM who said that every DG who reported to him had more time to look at that issue, whatever issue was you were bringing, than he did.
Yeah.
So if I'm reporting up, I have more time to deal with that issue than the person I'm reporting up to. It's on me to propose.
I'll give you another example. This is from the late 90s, okay?
Progressing.
Yeah, we're progressing. We had in 1998 proposals for merger proposals from 4 of the major Canadian banks to merge. That was a big issue at the time. It was quite controversial. It was on the front page of the paper and so forth. And it had at least 3 different sort of streams of advice coming into the Minister of Finance. There was a prudential stream of advice from the Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions. There was advice from Finance on the overall financial sector policy concerns, and there was advice coming from the Competition Bureau on the competition issues and the framing of relevant markets and so forth. And at the time, the Competition Bureau was pretty much prevented by statute from explicitly sharing information that came to it by means of its like subpoena powers and legal powers that it needed to do the job. But in order to bring together those various streams of advice for the purposes of advising the finance minister, we had to have some inkling of what was going on and how the Competition Bureau was approaching its work. And so I could have just gone to the deputy minister and said, well, there are these barriers, and so we're just going to have to wait and see. We won't be able to, I can't tell you anything about. So I could have taken that approach. But instead, I took an approach to sort of reach out to the relevant guy at the sort of DG level at the Competition Bureau and say, look, I understand the constraints that you're under, but let's get together on an informal basis, sort of once a week. This is a pretty intense file. It's moving week by week, day by day. So let's get together, once a week and tell me what you can without violating the constraints of the statute under which you operate, because that would send the whole thing into the crapper. And so managed to get at least a sense of where they were going on the bigger questions like the definition of the relevant market and so forth, and the timing concerns. When is the Bureau going to be able to come to its conclusion, and what sort of interactions they were having with the banks proposing and the banks against, and so on. And that sort of allowed me to at least get a jump start on bringing together those streams of advice, which rather than just saying, well, nothing I can do because of the statutory limitation. The other thing we did is
respecting the statutory limitation, but not allowing that to create extra rules in your head that aren't necessary.
Yeah. The other thing we did, though, was just after that, as part and parcel of that merger decision, we brought forward a very large package of changes to the financial sector legislation, 22 different acts, one of which was the Competition Act, and we put in a provision that allowed for information sharing with the Minister of Finance and the Commissioner of Competition. So it actually made a little more sense.
Right.
Subject to, some constraints, but
Sure.
it was, we actually codified kind of the practice that we put in place in order to make that decision work.
I noticed you did that not to make it easier for you, not to make it easier for your successors, but rather to make sense while respecting the intent of the previous legislation. And finding a way to make that work for all parties.
Yeah, not respecting that legislation could have been kind of disastrous from the point of view of the integrity of the decision that was being brought, and the advice that was being brought independently by the Commissioner of Competition to the Minister.
Right.
One of the this is where I'm going to go a little more off topic here, Daniel, as well. But
sure.
one of the dimensions along which you have to kind of make up your mind as a senior executive. In speaking truth to power is the extent to which you want to present yourself as an expert in a subject matter, as opposed to more of a public policy generalist who's surveyed the landscape.
Right.
In my earlier work on international trade policy, I became an expert in something really. I'm going to insult some of the folks on the line here if there's anybody from GAC who's working on trade policy, but I became an expert in the really narrow area of anti-dumping and countervailing duties.
Sure.
So there's some big policy issues around that, softwood lumber and so forth, but when you get down to negotiating the fine details, the content is as dry as toast. It makes tax law look interesting. Oh wait, I just insulted a bunch of tax.
Just insulted revenue, transport, finance, and global affairs.
But you've got to be aware of your own sort of tendencies and biases and predilections. If being an expert in something is your thing, then by all means, find yourself a niche like that and go for it. Mm-hmm. It's not it doesn't speak to my strengths. I get bored easily. That's the frank truth of the matter.
Good self-awareness.
So I have a job now in Western diversification where on one day of the week I can be talking to a First Nations band about their need for a freezer for their fish plant somewhere on the north coast of BC. The next day I can be talking to the particle physicists at Triumph about their latest efforts at manufacturing medical isotopes in a dispersed fashion and so on. So I have a job right now that suits me to a T. But you've got to know yourself as to whether you're comfortable with that sort of, being a mile wide and an inch deep,
right,
or whether you're really better focused on a particular subject area. And if you're comfortable in your own skin, in respect of that, on that dimension, generalist versus specialist knowledge, you'll be better off at that job of speaking truth to power if you're coming from a place of deep expertise or if you're coming from a place of generalized knowledge.
Interesting. You're not saying that being narrow and deep or broad and shallow in terms of the depth of knowledge. And you're not saying that either is preferable and neither is a weakness in any event, but being comfortable with where you come from on there. Are you looking at this in a broad context? Are you looking at this in a detailed context?
Yeah. And that, that's a good transition to that other sort of dimension along which my career has traveled, which is working at the center in Ottawa, as opposed to working in a region. Working in a region presents you as a senior executive with a very different set of interactions compared to working in Ottawa. I'm going to generalize here, make a sweeping generalization. Those are the best kinds of generalizations. When in a senior executive position in Ottawa, you spend 90% of your time interacting with other senior executives. Working in a region, your interactions are much less intermediated. So you're often working much more directly with Canadians who want something from their government, right? And so you have to be, in a regional context, much more open to that sort of interaction. And it doesn't necessarily, I wouldn't say it necessarily comes naturally to me. I will take you back to an earlier job where I had for some reason, my name got on a list of people you should talk to if you're having trouble with your bank. And I don't know how my name got on that list, but you can imagine that the phone calls came in thick and fast. That was the first time in my career when I had to not answer my own phone, when I had to have my assistant answer the phone. But I also, as a sort of a discipline, I made a point of taking about 5 of those calls myself every week. And they were heartrending, some of them. I remember vividly a call from an elderly woman who had just realized that she'd been taken in by the Nigerian phone scam. And there was very little we could actually do for her, refer to credit counseling, that kind of thing. But this was actually just somebody that wanted to talk through what had just happened to her with somebody in authority that knew a little bit about it. And it was really it was an eye-opener. That's one of the roles you play. You play that role much more often in a regional context. You're much more often in front of real-life Canadians, real-life stakeholders with things that they want from their government, and you have to listen. Even though in a lot of cases you're not actually going to be able to solve their problem, you're there to listen. That is one of the things that's one of the services that government provides to citizens is an ear to those that have a problem. Right. And you do, I would submit, an awful lot more of that, much more directly in a regional context than you do in the Ottawa context. One of the best descriptions of that came from one of my former colleagues in Newfoundland, who described the role of a senior executive in the region as opposed to Ottawa as being a big rock on a small beach. And that is really a pretty good description of the sort of day-to-day reality of an executive in a regional context.
I'm struck that you're using examples that come from a central agency like finance, that deal with international issues like the anti-dumping, that deal with transport and major issues there, Western economic diversification. When you're talking about being from a region, some of these lessons, they stand in the way of someone saying, ah oui, mais nous sommes différents. Nous sommes pas la même, nous sommes une région comme l'Atlantique, nous sommes un ministère différent comme n'importe quel. And one of the things that I notice is that each department is unique, just like all the others, and that there are some portable lessons, even when we think that. Given that experience, you have been the person who was the power, to whom people needed to speak. And one of the questions we have is when you are the power and someone wishes to challenge your thinking, how do you receive that?
It's interesting your point about how every department is different, every region is different. I learned very soon after moving out to work in the British Columbia context to say BC is different. Right? My other colleagues within Western diversification from the other 3 Western provinces get really, really tired of hearing that BC is different. My deputy minister is also kind of tired of hearing that BC is different, but it's still true. The way that I put it to him most recently is, well, look, you do have to concede that BC is far and away the least rectangular of the Western provinces. So, I guess the real answer to your question is you just have to stick to your guns. You have to have some confidence. You have to develop confidence in your own knowledge of the context in which you're operating, and you have to stick to your guns and do so in a way that doesn't insist that you win every argument. After all, central role as public servants is that fearless advice and faithful implementation. So the fearless advice has to be fearless. You have to actually not go in with the objective that you're going to win every argument, because you're not.
Right.
But
Which isn't the job. The job is to provide the fearless advice,
yeah, and to make sure that you've provided to
not to win.
to your deputy, to your minister, the best advice you can possibly do. And if that means at the end of the day that your advice is not going to be accepted, then so be it. That is not a failure of executive action. It's not a values and ethics dilemma. It's what we do. We provide that advice, and sometimes it's accepted and sometimes it's not. And then you move on to the faithful implementation phase.
I've often heard that described as do what you think is right, keep the boss informed, and change direction when asked. And then do what you think is right, keep the boss informed, and change direction when asked. So it's vital that decision makers have that intel, have what you think is your best information. Yeah. When you're on the receiving end of someone challenging you who reports to you or is elsewhere, not at the same level of the hierarchy,
right,
how do you prepare yourself to accept that constructively?
A couple of things in response to that. One phrase that I find myself using very, very often with staff, especially with more junior staff, is when we're having a discussion and I'm, blue skying and coming up with a sort of a half-formed thought, as I'm wont to do. The phrase I often use with them is, okay, tell me if I'm wrong, but, and then I stop myself and I say, by the way, I mean that. Yeah. Your job in this conversation right here, right now, is to tell me if I'm wrong. That's actually what I need from you. So speak up. If you think I'm off track here in my blue skying, speak up. So that phrase, tell me if I'm wrong, but you have to mean it. You have to actually mean it, and you have to make sure they understand that you mean it.
Yes.
That's one of the most powerful phrases in the vocabulary for dealing with exactly that situation. The other thing I would say on that is that you actually do have to be inclusive. You do actually have to be a good listener. And one of the ways that I constantly correct myself is, I was trained as an economist. I'm a numbers guy, so I tend to collect stylized facts in my head about things like. Here's a good one. The proportion of the public service that is in the National Capital Region as opposed to the regions.
I can hear the applause in several places at the other end of the camera.
That number used to be 60% outside the NCR, 40% in the NCR. I was about to use that number a little while ago, and I realized, wait a minute, I don't know if that's actually true anymore. So you have to correct for those stylized facts. And by the way, it's now 55% outside the NCR and 45%.
Wow.
Last time I checked.
Yep.
But you have to be ready to question your own, like those stylized facts. You have to be ready to question your own assumptions in a conversation, particularly if you're doing policy work or program policy work. If you have an idea about how a program really should work, because it's because it's worked that way in the past, you have to be really ready to question your own assumptions, and to do that by listening to the people around you is the best way to get at that result. Right?
Bravo. Ça veut dire qu'on a mentionné l'idée de donner aux gens la permission de parler, de renforcer ça en acceptant, en montrant du respect pour les gens qui lèvent des idées comme ça. Being a good listener, I'm sure we've had plenty folks who are out there doing that now. Thank you for the question that was sent in to us. Being ready to question our own assumptions. One of the tools for that is the pre-mortem, sitting down a year from today and writing why something didn't work. And encouraging my staff to do that, my direct reports, means that as a member of the team, they're identifying what might go wrong so that we can succeed, instead of feeling like they're not being a team player by identifying something. Yeah. Last thoughts you want to share with folks across the country, about 200 executives, listening to how to speak truth to power and survive the responsibility?
Last thought is on the surviving part.
Yep.
Pay attention to work-life balance. That expression is actually backwards. It should be life-work balance. Okay, maybe that's me coming from BC, but you have to be a mentally healthy individual in order to do those difficult conversations, in order to have confidence in yourself. One of the things is make time for yourself. Early on, when we first brought in electronic calendars that everybody could read, at the time I had a young kid who was helping to coach his soccer team. I put in there, leave to coach soccer. And rather than, leave personal or something like that. When people understand
Yeah.
what it is that you need to do in order for your work-life balance, people will tend to respect that. I almost never got calls on the cell phone while I was standing beside the soccer field watching a bunch of kids run around after a soccer ball. Had I just booked off that time,
Right.
I probably wouldn't have had the same result. So be clear with people that you have a need for work-life balance and that you're pursuing it, and don't be shy about it. Don't be ashamed about it. It's something that every one of us needs to do in order to be the strongest executive that you can be. Right?
Thank you very much, Gerry Salembier, Assistant Deputy Minister with Western Economic Diversification, responsible for British Columbia. Sage lessons on how to speak truth to power so that we are providing that fearless advice to be followed by faithful implementation of whatever the decisions are, and surviving the responsibility by taking care of ourselves. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you, Daniel. Pleased to be here.